Welcome to the Krusty Fox and, Sex in the City. No, hear me out. I love this show. Not because it's good, because spoiler alert, it isn't. Or because of the dodgy 90s and early noughties fashion. Not even for the highly questionable, even for the time, relationship advice. I enjoy it because near enough all of the characters are competing with each other to be the worst person alive. And just when you thought they'd achieved peak train wreck, they find a way to outdo themselves. So join me in exploring the story of a group of friends who are continually surprised that self-interest, vindictiveness, and occasionally outright insanity don't make for a happy ever after. The first ever episode begins with one of the many self-indulgent voiceovers we'll get from our problematic heroine, Carrie Bradshaw. Carrie is a sex columnist for the New York Star, but don't worry about retaining that piece of information because she rarely remembers it herself. Carrie tells us the story of Elizabeth, a writer who moves to New York and meets Tim, a wealthy, popular investment banker. We're told that Tim is one of NYC's many eligible bachelors, but in what becomes a recurring theme throughout the series, he's actually just a plain man in a beige suit with a haircut which suggests that he's at least mildly sexist. English Rose Elizabeth, who is clearly and unrepentantly Australian, embarks on a 2-week yuppie love affair with Tim. Their whirlwind romance is swiftly torpedoed when Tim cancels a planned dinner with Elizabeth and his parents while wearing the kind of suspenders that scream "my success is mostly performative." Elizabeth conveniently overlooks the fact that they've only known each other for a fortnight and promptly goes insane when Tim fails to reschedule their dinner or return her calls. She relays this story to a chain-smoking Carrie, who laments the supposed end of love in Manhattan, in blissful ignorance of the decade she's about to spend trying to force a succession of men into it whether they like it or not. As if by way of a mission statement, Carrie asks the audience why there are so many great unmarried women but so few great unmarried men. This question goes unanswered for the rest of the series because Carrie fails to pick up on the show's overarching message. Every man and woman is awful in their own unique and horrifying way. We're treated to a bunch of talking head clips, which along with Carrie breaking the fourth wall are mercifully phased out by the end of season 2. Possibly due to them all being the same, in the sense that the men spout hot toxic garbage and the women blame them for the failure of every relationship in the history of the universe. During the course of this, we're introduced to Carrie's friends. Miranda Hobbs, a terminally judgmental corporate lawyer who nobody would be friends with in real life, and Charlotte York, an art dealer who thinks and acts like a warped Jane Austen character. We also meet Skipper Johnston, a friend of Carrie's who, in a sign of the times, is labelled as a website creator. Skipper is also given the dubious title of hopeless romantic, though he eventually reveals himself to be a late 90s prototype for a nice guy neckbeard. You know the type, the ones who think that they deserve intercourse because they opened the door for their date and remembered not to call her a whore. Not to be left out, Miranda echoes a line from one of the toxic Vox Pops when she claims to have dated some short, fat and poor men and found them to be just as self-centered and unappreciative as the good-looking ones. Stay classy, Miranda. We catch up with the three friends at Miranda's birthday meal, which is inexplicably held at what looks like a roadside cafe with drag queen waitresses. Here we also meet the last group member, Samantha Jones. Samantha is a PR executive and sexually liberated commitment phobe. She's routinely positioned as a bit of a lost cause, but ultimately ends up being the only one of them with an ounce of common sense. Here lies the hook of this episode, as the ladies discuss the shifting power balance between men and women in the city. Women, they say, are finally achieving and earning as much as the local men are. Apparently this troubles the menfolk of NYC as they worry that women might turn the tables and begin treating them as sexual objects. Carrie, never one to miss an opportunity to be contrary, asks where romance is in all of this. Miranda recalls the time she dated a poet, which is frankly her own fault. Charlotte, meanwhile, is scandalised at the idea of her friends giving up on love. This proves to be the first of many signs that she thinks of herself as a Disney princess fighting to stay afloat in a veritable sea of sluts. We're then treated to one of the show's most frequent tropes, that of the ladies stuffing themselves with delicious food but somehow remaining a size 2. In this case, Carrie sits in bed with her laptop, shotgunning a tub of Ben & Jerry's. I can only assume that she's been sniffing each spoonful before flinging them out of a nearby open window into the street. Carrie then has dinner with old friend Stanford Blatch, a washed-up talent agent and one of only a handful of gay characters in the show's entire run who are allowed to speak. Surprisingly for an HBO show created and often written by gay men, Stanford is a lecherous one-note stereotype who looks and dresses like a Christmas elf in the off-season. Carrie spots an old flame called Kurt at the restaurant's bar, who she declares to be a self-centered creep. Presumably keen to meet him at his level, Carrie decides to experiment on him for her column by using him as a sexual object. She wastes no time in obtaining an invitation to his apartment that afternoon, a goal she achieves with the kind of cigarette-sharing flirtation usually seen in the alleys behind dive bars. She has an apparently satisfactory off-screen tumble with him, complete with some unconvincing sound effects, and then leaves before he can get any satisfaction of his own. This, we're led to believe, is a stunning win for feminism and definitely not an unnecessary mind game being played by a narcissist. Although, in fairness, Kurt does use the word alrighty when they're in bed together, and so I'm not really sure whose side I'm on anymore. Outside of Kurt's apartment, Carrie's purse is knocked out of her hands and its contents spill onto the pavement. A supposedly handsome stranger with another sexist haircut and slug-like eyebrows that betray the just for men he's been using for a decade comes to her aid. Skipper later meets Carrie for coffee and confesses that he hasn't been intimate with a woman for a year. Carrie expresses surprise since he's such a nice guy, fueling an inadequacy complex which I'm sure by now Skipper would have parlayed into a moderator role on an incel subreddit. When Skipper declares that he just has too many feelings, Carrie bluntly and problematically asks if he's sure that he isn't gay. Because, as any psychology textbook will tell you, only gay men have emotions. Carrie sets Skipper up on a date with Miranda, who she believes will hate him. Her supposed kindness could only come from her also hating Skipper and harbouring a desire to witness his slow torture over the course of an entire evening. Later, Charlotte calls Carrie to let her know that she has a date with Capote Duncan, a publishing big shot, allegedly unobtainable bachelor and possessor of the world's most pretentious name. Charlotte intends not to treat Capote like an object, I assume because there's only room for one in a relationship and she's already accepted the job. At a club appropriately named Chaos, Miranda turns up for her date with Skipper, suitably dressed like a pallbearer. Skipper himself sits slack-jawed at the bar, which seems to be his interpretation of a less sensitive man. As predicted, Miranda wastes no time in identifying reasons to hate the ground he walks on, a situation Skipper then tries to remedy with some uninvited touching. Elsewhere in the club, Carrie runs into Kurt again. He turns the tables on her by actually being into her objectification of him. This disproves Carrie's theory, and because yet another man has managed to escape before she's sucked his soul out through his face, leaves her crestfallen. Samantha points out a man she's into across the room, who turns out to be the stranger who helped Carrie earlier. Unfortunately, she introduces him as the next Donald Trump, an honour that has aged about as well as porn star urine on hotel sheets. Carrie describes Samantha's self-confidence as deluded. This slur doesn't age especially well as the series progresses, since Carrie's own belief in herself is about on the level of someone in a full body cast competing in the Olympic high jump. Charlotte, keen to keep Capote on the hook, agrees to go back to his apartment with him. She manages to maintain her composure even though it's decorated like his interior designer closed their eyes, held out their arms and spun around in the IKEA discount warehouse. Keen not to give away too much on the first date, because her brain has seemingly time travelled to 1847, Charlotte casts around for a reason to leave. She ends up deploying the only excuse for ending a date any of the core group ever seem to have, namely that she has to get up early the next morning. Downstairs, she climbs into a cab, but Capote jumps in next to her. He heads for Chaos, since if Charlotte isn't going to stay over, then he'll find someone else who will. The framing of this seems to suggest that Capote is a douchebag, but since Charlotte spent the evening playing a heavily calculated game openly intended to dangle herself in front of him just enough to maintain interest, I'd call them even. Back inside the club, Samantha, who actually knows how to treat men like objects, hits on Carrie's mysterious Mr. Big, as he is now known, but is firmly rejected. Outside, Miranda attempts to similarly reject Skipper, but he appears to have decided that the opposite of a nice guy is one who doesn't understand the concept of the word no. Worryingly, Miranda is into this. Samantha ends up going home with Capote, because everyone's favourite snack after a night of heavy drinking is sloppy seconds. In the early hours, Carrie's failure to hail a cab is remedied by Mr. Big when she accepts a ride in his town car with a shocking disregard for her personal safety. Even Big's calamitous pickup lines, such as "so what have you been doing lately," aren't enough of a red flag to have her tucking and rolling out of the door. This may in part be because Carrie has clearly been waiting all night for somebody to ask her what she does for a living, which Big does. Depressingly, she introduces herself as a sexual anthropologist, which a sneering Big is quick to misinterpret as a euphemism for hooker. Carrie appears to find this charming, which is a good primer for how their long, storied, and largely gross history will play out as the series goes on. When Carrie tells Big about the experiment she's undertaking for her column, he misguidedly claims that she isn't like that. As a reminder, he bases this on literally 30 seconds of total interaction. He claims that he isn't like that either, a statement which would cause future Carrie to burst into indignant flames. Or at least it would if it wasn't for the fact that when it comes to men, she has the memory of a goldfish. One of those white ones that floats near the surface. When Big continues reaching by assuming that Carrie has never been in love, she reacts with what might be inexplicable offence. It's difficult to tell because just like all of her wild overreactions, she never actually explains it. As annoyingly gentle sax plays in the background, Carrie leaves the car but runs back to ask Big whether he's ever been in love. Again, why this is relevant to anything that the episode's supposed to be about is a bit of a mystery, but the way it's shot is clearly meant to evoke old-style Hollywood romances. This would prove a lot more effective if the characters weren't spouting absolute toss at each other. Big replies that he has been in love, but in a more forceful way that I can't say on YouTube because despite it being 2020, swearing is still a crime punishable by search algorithm banishment. His driver then pulls away at exactly the right moment, which can only mean that the entire thing was staged, Big is an evil genius, and what we just witnessed was him embarking on a decade-long gaslighting campaign. Carrie spins around to face the camera, ingenue style, and we're treated to a delightful freeze frame of her looking... You know, I honestly couldn't tell you. Wistful, contemplative, mildly constipated, who knows. And with that, we end our first half hour with literally the worst people on the face of the planet. Join me next time as they continue to pile rotten furniture onto their raging personal dumpster fires.